Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. I am Shane. We'll get into proper introductions in a second, but this is SciComm Advocacy, creating an effective policy one-pager. And so before we even get into things, I want to take a quick poll. So I'm going to launch this for all of you. If you could just take a minute and please, just from 1 to 5, let us know how currently or how prepared you currently feel to engage with policymakers. And this could be congressional members, this could be state folks, this could be your local school board, whatever it might be. And also, as you all are doing that, depending on how sensitive y'all speakers are, if you're hearing a rattling coming from my end, it is raining very hard right now in the DC region. So apologies about that. All right, looks like that's about everyone. I'll give you all a few more seconds. Okay, so, all right, so a bell curve, a little bit skewed towards the bottom, but most of you are somewhere right in the middle. And that is good to know. Okay, so now actually let's get into it. So some of you have been to these webinars before. If you have, we'll get through this really quick. If you haven't, just a little bit about who we are. So Sharing Science is part of the American Geophysical Union. We're a giant Earth and Space Science society. We have a bunch of journals, a bunch of small conferences, and usually one giant conference every year in person. The conference is still happening this year, just online like most other things. Within AGU is the Sharing Science program. This is what we do. We are mostly scientists who help other scientists talk to non-scientists. We provide them with skills, tools, resources, whatever they might be. And we do this through a number of different ways. We have workshops, both, well, usually in person, but right now online. And we do them through this right here, through webinars. We have a lot of online resources, a very robust social media presence. We provide lots of outreach opportunities, hands-on support, that type of thing. And this is part of our webinar series that we're doing this year, this Skills for a Complete Scientist. If you've missed any of the previous ones, you can go back into our archive and find those. We'll provide information on how to do that. And if you're interested in any of the ones coming up on writing op-eds or giving a virtual presentation, whatever it might be, we encourage you to sign up. So who is this voice that's been talking to you? My name is Shane Hamlin. I'm one of the 2 core staff in the Sharing Science program. I am a scientist by training. I'm an ecologist. But I came to this Sharing Science program actually through policy. I ended up doing kind of a policy postdoc here in Washington, D.C. before getting to Sharing Science. And now I kind of am this jack of all trades. So that's me. I'll let Olivia introduce herself.
Thanks, Shane. Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Ambrogio, also a biologist ecologist by training, although we didn't plan for that with Sharing Science, and also had a rather circuitous route to coming here and doing science communication. I still like to do some on my own in the biology sphere. So this is me taking photos of horseshoe crabs, and I like to do what I call stealth educating, coming upon people on beaches and surprising them with marine animal facts.
And too far. So that's us, but we're going to really just hand this over to the experts today. Our colleagues in our public affairs department, these are our science policy colleagues. So at this point, Brittany, Michael, you want to introduce yourselves and take it away.
Thanks, Shane. Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Webster, and I'm the program manager of AGU's Public Affairs or Science Policy team. And the AGU's Public Affairs team really has 2 goals: to ensure science informs policy on Capitol Hill, and to help scientists connect with their legislators, which is the venue we most often work with the Sharing Science team. And in my role, I spearhead AGU's Capitol Hill strategy and work to influence policymakers. And I've been at AGU for about 5 years now. Before that, I worked on Capitol Hill, and I'm actually a lawyer by training. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Brittany. So yes, my name is Michael Villafranca. I'm also a part of the public affairs team at AGU. And alongside Brittany, I help kind of lead the efforts on the Hill doing our government relations work, as well as some of our grassroots work as well. My background is in actually public policy and government relations. No science here, but so we'll go ahead and get started. Before we get into the kind of the core piece of the webinar, which is around one-pagers, we're just going to take a quick step back and kind of talk about like who are policymakers? What do we mean by policymakers? And so generally speaking, policymakers are government actors who use policy as a tool to address societal problems and issues of public concern. And policymakers can be found at all levels of government, from the local level, which includes like counties, townships, and cities. So for example, the city of Chicago, to the state, territory, or provincial level. And here you can see the example is the province of Ontario, to the national or federal level. So for the examples, the United States or India. And the last level is the international level, and you can see the example here is the European Union. So when considering kind of the three branches of government, so you have the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Most people, or many people, tend to think of policymakers solely falling within the legislative branch, so your legislators. But policymakers are actually found within the executive and judicial branches as well. So for the legislative branch, they're elected lawmakers. They're expected to collate the views, interests, demands, and problems of their constituents, and then harmonize them and translate them into policy proposals for the legislature. While you have the executive branch, their main responsibility is to implement public policies. However, many executive leaders, such as the president, also plays a pivotal role in the initiation and formulation of policies. For example, when you have presidential candidates running, they have a platform, a campaign platform of policies. Those are the policies that their promises to propose and implement if elected into office. But unlike the other two branches, the judicial branch does not have the constitutional power to initiate, formulate, or implement policies. However, through its power to interpret the Constitution and laws, the judiciary brings about judicial intervention, which can not only modify policies, but also redirect policy and action, as well as moderate the implementation activities. So some additional policymaker characteristics, there's primary versus supplementary. So primary policymakers are those that have constitutional power to formulate policy. So again, example is legislators. Sometimes the executive, such as via executive orders. The U.S. president does executive orders; those are considered policies. And then supplementary policymakers receive their authority to formulate policy from the primary policymakers. So supplementary policymakers would be the administrators in the executive branch, such as like the department heads or agency heads. And then you have elected versus non-elected. Some policymakers are elected, such example, again, legislators, presidents, mayors, governors, sometimes judges on the local level, state level, depending on where you are. Others are appointed, and again, those are the department and agency heads. So the U.S. president appoints the heads of the various departments and agencies under his administration, and then again, some judges. So the U.S. Supreme Court judges are appointed. So just to highlight, again, to kind of go back, the big highlights here, kind of like the main actors using policy to address societal problems. Those are policymakers. They're here to solve problems of society. So now let's talk a little bit about why you want to engage with them. So I'm going to give you two reasons. The first reason, need to go back. So the first reason that policymakers work for you. Citizens play vital roles in informing policymakers. Your interests and desires are very consequential for public policies. As citizens, you're also voters. So through the electoral process, you help produce basic changes to public policy. So you can actually vote out policymakers that don't satisfy your needs with their policies. And as a constituent, you have a lot of influence over policy decisions. For example, on this slide, you can see a study from a few years ago showing that an in-person visit from a constituent has a lot of influence for 46% of policymakers that were polled, compared to that of a lobbyist like Brittany and myself, which was about 8%. But we've seen more recent numbers that show this is over 50% now. And we can also share multiple anecdotal stories showing scientists who actually became resources for the legislators, and some who have even helped craft legislation because of it. Second big reason is that science is vital to informing policy. Policymakers need the best information available to make sound decisions. Using the Congress as an example, U.S. Congress as an example, you could probably count on probably two hands how many policymakers on the Hill actually have science backgrounds. We don't necessarily, every elected official is not a scientist, so they need to rely on experts when they're putting together policies that are aimed at addressing a problem. So let me just moving on here. So overall, policymakers want to hear from you. They value staying in touch with their constituents. Your conversations with them guide their policymaking and re-elections, that hinge on their ability to kind of serve their constituents. Again, you have the ability to vote them out if their policies don't meet your needs. And individualized communications are highly persuasive. We hear this a lot, especially on the Hill from members of Congress, that personalized like letters, one-pagers, and emails, those have the most impact in terms of influencing policymakers' decisions. And you should definitely focus on sending more personal messages to make sure that you're capturing your own voice and perspective. And then thinking about what the policymaker actually wants to know. So here are some things to think about. What policy actions do constituents desire? These are things that policymakers think about. What do the constituents prioritize? Why do the constituents prioritize that action? What are the impacts of this on their particular district or state? And what personal stories, again, connect to this particular policy? So again, just to highlight for why to engage with policymakers. Again, citizens are very important roles in informing the decision process, and science is vital for making sure that policymakers have the best information available to make their sound policy decisions. And so before I switch over to Brittany, just a reminder that we will have some time at the end of the full presentation for questions. I know I covered some kind of high-level information here on policy background. So I'll take it over to you, Brittany.
Thanks, Michael. With that background, I'm going to start by talking about what's a one-pager, what it's good for, and then discuss how you can create your own. Simply put, one-pagers help to ensure that legislators and their staff remember you long after you meet or interact with them. For this reason, you'll sometimes hear one-pagers referred to as leave behind. The goal of your one-pager is to provide enough information that if someone wants to recall you and or your meeting, they can easily. And I'm going to be saying legislators because I live in the world of Capitol Hill and that's normally who I'm dealing with, but really this could be any policymaker. So a one-pager is a compelling snapshot of you and your main points. I'm going to break down this statement, but I want to first point out that all the information, sorry, I went too far. But first I want to point out that all the information in the document on the left is featured in the one-pager on the right. And I hope we can all agree that the one-pager on the right is easier to read, more engaging, and more interesting visually. So you want your one-pager to be compelling, and by that I mean engaging and visual. So here are a couple of examples from actual one-pagers. Both the pictures instantly draw your eye and make you want to know more about how these people came to be in these beautiful but harsh environments. Many scientists go to awesome locations or see amazing things as part of their fieldwork, and adding those pictures to your one-pager can be very compelling. I also wanted to highlight how you can make technical research engaging. The top right-hand corner contains a great example of how to make a technical issue more interesting and visual. The image is trying to showcase how a satellite company's spectrum proposal will disrupt GPS. I think we can all agree this is a pretty technical issue, even though they do provide some context with decibel levels. This is hard to imagine. I'll also highlight that this is a great example of social math. There's a helpful site, The Measure of Things, that can help you find social math analogies for your work. Your one-pager should be a snapshot, and by that, I mean short and readable. Here's a one-pager from the National Science Board talking about the science and engineering indicators for the state of Georgia. This is just a snapshot of the indicators for Georgia out of a report that is hundreds of pages long. In a one-pager, your font should be no less than 12 point. You're highlighting your key information for your audience, not condensing an entire report. Include information about who you are and who your organization is. For the personal one-pager on the left, I want to spotlight a couple of things. The scientist includes her contact information, a picture of herself doing field work, she talks about her research, and she includes the logo of her research group. So yeah, as I think Olivia was saying, is that the NSF one-pager also includes information about how you can learn more and connect with NSF as well. So very similar to a personal one-pager. So yeah, and finally, your main point. This is the full one-pager I excerpted from before, and I want to draw your attention to how obvious it is that this person has 4 points. Similarly, in your one-pager, you're not trying to condense your thesis into one page. Instead, you want to really take a step back and ask yourself, what are the handful of takeaways from this research or collaboration that are most relevant to this audience? So now that we have a sense of what a one-pager is, I want to highlight that I've been focusing on one-pagers directed to your policymakers. However, a one-pager could be useful to share with other stakeholders so that they can utilize your expertise as well. For example, if there's an agriculture group or local ocean advocacy group and you want to provide them with a sense of your expertise and how you could help them, a one-pager could also help scientists or experts outside your field understand your work. Science can be so jargon heavy that sometimes even among scientists, it's hard to communicate. And finally, a one-pager could be helpful in promoting yourself and your research, especially outside of academia, where CV is not really what people are looking for. These are just a couple of examples. Regardless of who you're planning to share your one-pager with, just remember to tailor it to that audience. Just like a cover letter, one size does not fit all. So to recap, a one-pager is a compelling snapshot of you and your research. One-pagers can be used as a leave-behind to ensure policymakers remember you, to help stakeholders understand how your expertise might be useful to them, to help other scientists understand your work, or to promote you and your research. Just remember to tailor your one-pager to fit your audience. Now I'm going to talk through the elements needed for an effective policy one-pager. So I put an asterisk by policy because depending on your audience, you might not want or need all of these elements that I'm about to discuss. Your policy one-pager should include these 6 elements: a title, information about your research or expertise, an ask, points to support your ask, visuals to support your ask, and your contact information. As someone who made her first scientific poster this year, I want to say if you can make a scientific poster, you can make a one-pager. And I want to encourage you to check out our worksheet in the handout section on how to create a one-pager. And so here are a couple of examples of one-pagers that AGU members have used in their congressional meetings that I'm going to be pulling from as I walk through the elements of a one-pager. Let's see that. Okay. So a one-pager title can be descriptive of your work or research, as we see here, but it can also be more action-oriented. Regardless, it should be fairly short and give your reader a clear sense of the content and purpose of your one-pager. So when you meet with policymakers in any scenario or any level, they're going to expect you to have an ask. And that's basically, what do you want the policymaker to do? Your ask needs to be three things: specific, actionable, and achievable. In a week, 6 months, or 2 years, will you be able to say, yes, my policy took action on my ask, or not? This is generally why asking your legislators to support science is not a good idea. Instead, ask them to vote yes on a bill, visit your lab, or investigate an issue. Simultaneously, the ask has to be realistic for the person. Is it within their power? For instance, you can't ask your mayor to question why the EPA did something because they have no oversight authority over the EPA. It also has to be within their policy positions or stances. For example, if your legislator introduced a bill to defund the EPA, it's probably not a good idea to ask them to increase funding for the EPA. And finally, it has to be actionable in a timely manner. So within a reasonable amount of time, is the policymaker going to be able to act on your request? For example, asking your senator to vote yes on a bill that's already passed the Senate is not timely. So here are a couple of examples of asks incorporated into one-pagers. In this one on the left, she's requesting funding for science, and she does a pretty good job of following that up with a brief message of why earth science funding is important to her and her state. The example at the top has an ask that includes several elements. In general, however, I recommend you have 1 to 2 asks. So for example, a funding ask, and then maybe an ask about a specific bill. And lastly, here's an example from AGU's most recent virtual advocacy day event, where we hope to advance these 3 bills. I'll note here, you should always send your one-pager to policymakers electronically, either before or after your meeting. This is great because you can hyperlink to more information or sources like the bills hyperlinked here. Other than clarity and brevity, which we talked about before, I also want to emphasize that your main points should clearly support your ask. What's the message supporting your ask that is going to convince your policymakers to act on your ask? Similar to your research section, a Google search or an advanced degree should not be needed to decipher any graphics you include in your one-pager. They should be totally clear to the average person. There should be no acronyms, abbreviations, or terms that need to be defined, and the point of the graph should be clear.
So for this part, it's really important to make sure that your contact information and in your institution, if applicable, is on your one-pager. So that way, your policymaker or the staff can follow up with you if there's any additional questions, especially if they're going to be working with you a lot closer on a policy. And one of the things you want to think about, after you're as you're putting your one-pager together is, can someone with no prior knowledge of this topic understand your main points? And if you've ever taken, one of Shane or Olivia's other, webinars or workshops, they really drive this, home, that you want to make sure that your message is clear and understandable to a wide variety to your audience. Why is it? It's not go over. There we go. Okay. So the high level here about how making your one-pager is just making sure that it's brief, understandable, that you have pictures, it's visually aesthetic, making sure that your ask is included on there, making sure that it's clear, and making sure that your contact information and a bit about yourself and your institution is included on the one-pager.
All right, this is Shane again. So thank you so much to Michael and Brittany, and thank you all of you for sticking with us. We can't emphasize enough how well the weather here was not cooperating, to say the least. But so we're not done yet. We have lots of time for Q&A. You all have been asking questions in the question box, and again, if you haven't yet, you have plenty of time to do that. What I want to do before we get into questions is just do one more poll, if you all don't mind. So I'm going to launch this. This is the same poll from the beginning. Just kind of want to get a quick spot check on how y'all are feeling now, having stayed with us for the past 30 or so minutes. All right, I'll give you all a few more seconds to put your vote in or respond to the poll. All right, looks like most folks have responded. What do we have now? Okay, so yeah, a little bit of a shift. So from majority going to 3 to 4, and that's really great. Again, we understand this was 30 minutes, and that's not a ton of time, but the fact that we were able to shift a little bit in these 30 minutes is really promising, and we have a ton of resources for after this webinar that I'm going to now hand it over to Olivia to chat about.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, so thanks everyone for this and for being patient as we deal with weather. I just want to remind you all that this webinar is part of a full series of skills for the complete scientist that we've been covering this year. As with this webinar, all of the past ones have been recorded and are archived, so you can watch those later if you're interested in catching up on any of these previous ones. And you can obviously sign up and register at webinars.agu.org if you'd like to attend any of the ones coming up. And do keep an eye out because we'll be doing another series in the new year. Also, from the policy front, Michael, you want to tell us a bit about this?
Yeah. So as Brittany mentioned previously, we had a virtual advocacy day event back in June that was centered around diversity, equity, inclusion, and we're having another one coming up next month during Earth Science Week, which is the October 11th through the 17th, focused on climate change. And there will be 3 ways that you'll be able to participate in engaging your legislators about climate change through virtual congressional meetings with your legislators or their staff, through personal video messages to your legislators on social media, or by doing writing an op-ed or letter to the editor in your local paper. We'll also be providing 3 trainings to help you prepare for your engagements the week before. So, and they will be held October 6th to the 8th. One of them is actually Olivia and Shane's webinar on writing an op-ed and letter to the editor, which I believe is on the 8th. If you're interested, please RSVP by the 23rd. There is a link on the slide. You can also go to our Twitter account, which is at AGU SciPol.
SciPolicy.
SciPolicy, yes, that's right. And we have several tweets out with links that go to the registration page.
And we'll also be sending follow-up emails to everyone next week that will include the recording of this webinar, and we'll include this link there too. So in case you don't have time to write it down or go to the Twitter account just now. So also, oops, I went too far, but we are on all the social media, both us individually and AGU and Sharing Science. So if you are also on all the social media or any of them, please follow us. Please join a dialogue with us. Please get involved. It's one of the great ways that we learn more about our community. And also, if you have not already joined the Sharing Science community, please do. It's a very short form. You just give a little profile about what you're interested in doing, what you have done, what your scientific expertise is, and you have access to a whole wealth of resources, including a vast number of social science articles on the science of science communication that we've collected for people, as well as a chance to communicate with your peers, with other people who value science communication and policy. So again, please do consider our various social media accounts. Please join the Sharing Science community if you haven't already. And with that, I think we'll open it up to questions. So Shane, you want to start with the moderating on that?
Yeah, I'll start. And for those of you who are interested, this is what we look like. All right, so question for either you, Brittany or Michael, just kind of a clarification, a jargon thing. So Brittany, I think you said that you are lobbyists. I think it'd be helpful to kind of let folks know exactly what lobbyist does. The question is lobbyist defined as someone who does lobbying for a living? So maybe just some clarification there.
Yeah. So in general, it's I think it's exactly that. But really, it's more that you spend a certain amount of your time doing lobbying. Lobbying is not the only things I do. As I'm here with all of you today, we do a lot of like member education. But it also includes things like our congressional visit days and setting those up and kind of deciding what's exactly the message that Congress needs to hear right now. And so spending time kind of strategizing all of that is also kind of part of what makes me a lobbyist. So if you go and talk to your members of Congress for an afternoon or a day, even if you do it a couple times a year, that does not qualify as lobbying in the sense that you don't meet you don't meet a time threshold basically, and that's not how you spend your time professionally. So you wouldn't be considered a lobbyist, even if you, let's say, are faculty or a member of an organization that might actually employ a lobbyist or a government relations person. So that's a pretty high threshold that you really have to be doing this where I think the threshold might be like 25% of your time, which I'm guessing most of you don't quite meet that threshold.
Great, thank you. We have a handful of questions about our current digital circumstances, but one is, I suppose nobody is visiting policymakers during the pandemic. How do you get your one-pager into the right hands these days?
Yeah, I can take that one. It's definitely worth trying to do like a virtual meeting. Like I said, we did our first virtual advocacy day event, which is kind of the virtual version of our congressional visits days that we would normally do in person on the Hill. And we actually had many scientists who engaged with their legislators, set up meetings, whether some of them were just via phone call, some of them were actually via Zoom or one of the other video platforms. So there's still ways that you can still engage and communicate with your legislators. And making sure that you get your one-pager, you can email them before those meetings, share them during that time. And you can also share them during follow-up emails as well.
Thank you. Sticking with one-pagers specifically, there's questions around, so you showed a few different kind of versions and it might be dealer's choice, but specifically, I guess dimensions in the virtual world are different, but what size are we talking about? Like you said, it's like if you can make a poster, you can make a one-pager, but kind of what size, and is there any good rule of thumbs about kind of ratio of words to pictures to whatever's actually on the one-pager?
Yeah, so I would say no perfect ratio. So general size, we're talking about one page. It could be a front and back if you have lots of information shared. I think I shared a couple that were front and back. No special ratio, but I think your page should not be like 75% writing in 12-point font. You're going to be playing with formatting in terms of like, doing call out buttons or columns. So I think you want a good ratio of pictures or graphics to text. So, maybe like a half and half there. And again, you know, thinking about what those visuals might be and how do they support your message. But also I would say these are all going to be showed electronically. So, you know, think about, you know, what links can you share? Like, do you have links to videos? Do you have a personal website? Do you want to be sharing your, you know, YouTube, social media, what have you links? I think given the fact that everything's digital nowadays and people are going to be storing this like as a PDF, it literally, you can kind of cheat a lot in terms of what you can link to in providing additional content.
And just to clarify, for dimensions, you definitely want to make sure that, you know, especially if it's, you know, for your in-person visits, you want to make sure it's kind of like letter size 8x11. Digitally, if you're sending it digitally, it's, you know, you can kind of go beyond that. It's not that big of a deal, but again, you want to make sure that it's readable and easily accessible.
Do you have any, so this kind of goes to policymakers more in general, but any key advice on judging the audience's background? So for example, when you want to try to discuss regional sea level rise, how much to go into something like climate change?
Sure, I can take them. So yeah, something that we talk about in some of the workshops that we've done is you definitely want to do your research about your policymaker kind of before you start communicating with them. So you definitely want to look at, you know, you can go to, for Congress, you can go to their website. Most of the members of Congress have their own website. You can look at the issues, their platform, kind of like what are their main issues that they care about. What committees are they sitting on? What caucuses are they part of? What some of the legislation that they've, you know, introduced. You can kind of get an idea of what they care about there. You can also think about your geographic region. You know, wherever you're sitting, you know, where is that policymaker's district or state, and what are the big industries in that area? You can kind of get an idea of what they might care about that way. And you can also look at their social media as well to see kind of like what are some of the statements that they're kind of putting out. Doing that kind of research will help you kind of get an idea of what their position are on various policies and help you kind of gauge on putting your message together and talking about certain topics.
One here about, so a lot of the examples that y'all provided were presenting as a researcher. Are there any examples or best practices to present self as maybe you work in industry or just even a community member? Or I guess do a lot of the same kind of principles apply? It's what your message is and just making sure that formatting and those main points are coming across.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the same thing. I think all the same principles apply. You want to be thinking about how do you tailor your experience to that audience's needs? What are they going to respond to, and what kind of compelling snapshot can you present to them that's going to lead them to want to work with you or engage with you further? So I think I would say almost all the same principles apply, but maybe your ask might look a little different.
We have a question that's kind of the in-person versus remotely thing. It might be moot right now, but how often will a policymaker or their aide have time to meet in person? And is there any sort of data on the effectiveness of sharing things entirely remotely or versus meeting in person? And I guess y'all can speak to this in current times and then kind of also in non-COVID times.
I'll take this one. So I will say that Congress has always been an in-person business. So there is no data on comparing kind of remote to virtual. I would say before the pandemic, I think meeting remotely with legislators was not even on the table. Occasionally, I think staffers or members of Congress that you have really good relationships with, you might have a call with them. But, you know, setting up a Zoom meeting with them was, I would say, pretty much out of the question. They would have been like, you need to come to DC. I think post-pandemic, Zoom meetings are going to continue. I think I've heard from many staffers that they're able to reach so many more constituents now and have so many more calls because a lot of times when you meet with a member of Congress or their staff, it's a 20 to 30-minute meeting, and now you can easily do them back to back because you don't have to go anywhere, but you're wherever you are sitting in your home. So yeah, so I would say there's really nothing to compare this to. I think expect this to continue though, because for a lot of people coming to DC is an obstacle. And so I think members of Congress and their staffers have actually really enjoyed virtual meetings. I think I answered all of your questions.
Yeah, well, there was a follow-up caveat that essentially said, referring to non-COVID times, but I think it's good that you mentioned that, yeah, things are kind of going to go back to normal, quote unquote, but they probably will also change a little bit as well. Brittany, you also touched on something, and maybe you can just touch or talk about it quickly. The difference between meeting with a staffer and an actual, I guess this is a more congressional level, but a staffer versus an actual congressional member. Kind of this, is a staffer not as good or something like that?
So yeah, no, not at all. Sometimes I actually prefer meeting with staffers because they tend to be much more, you can get a lot more substantive, I would say, with staffers. That's not always the case, but I think in general, and I say that because a lot of times the member of Congress, if you're a constituent, they're actually more interested in getting to know you. They want to learn about where you're from and what you do, but they might be a little distracting sometimes. And so meeting with a member of Congress can be really great, and it can be really impactful to be able to, literally give your ask and message into the, get it into the mind, can't think of an expression, mind of the member of Congress. But I think meeting with staffers can be just as effective, because really the member of Congress is having to deal with every single issue, every single policy issue you can possibly think about, whereas staffers tend to be much more focused. They'll have a portfolio broader in the House than it is in the Senate. And a lot of times those staffers tend to stick on those issues. I mean, I was a science staffer, and here I am at AGU. So a lot of times you can go more in depth with staffers, and they're just great to build relationships with as well, because a lot of times they are driving a lot of what the member is doing. And I didn't mention this before, but I will mention this now. Always give your one-pager, if you're giving it to someone in person, to the staffer. Do not give it to the member of Congress who will lose it somewhere. Give it to the staffer, who really are the ones who are going to collect and hold on to that information for when they need it in the future.
Thanks, Brittany. There's actually a question that I can answer here because it's a kind of a clerical one, but looking for kind of examples or templates of one-pagers. So for all of you on this webinar, in your little box, the go-to webinar template or the control panel, there's a tab that says handouts, and in there's a handful of PDFs, and one of those is actually a template on how to make an effective one-pager that Public Affairs has come up with. So that's there, and we will also, again, in these follow-up email, we will also provide links to useful information, including that template as well. So you'll have that as the example that we use. I'm going to put together a few questions, but there's a handful of questions basically about how in depth should specifically scientists go into about their research, and how much background information, and kind of what's that level of knowledge that they should assume. And kind of adding on top of that, are there folks at if they're at a university, are there folks at the university that they can work with to maybe help out with this?
I can take this one. Yeah, so again, you definitely don't want to assume that the person that you're handing your one-pager to, or even meeting with, if you're meeting, actually knows, has a science background, or even goes back to the talk about jargon, avoiding jargon. You want to make sure that an 8th grader can read your research and somewhat understand the basics of what your research does and what your asks are. And again, as Brittany mentioned, the beauty of having digital versions is that you can include links. So you can include links to reports, So for, to find additional information, and that's also why your contact information is there, is you want to, you're there as a resource for follow-up questions, because again, especially during meetings, your meetings are only going to be about 20 to 30 minutes long. That's not long enough to actually go in depth into what your research is and try to get in your ask and everything. To answer the other question, a lot of universities do have a government affairs office. So you can check with your own institution's office and talk to the government relations person there. They are well adept and experienced in actually doing what Brittany and I do, so they can also help work with you on your Onepager as well.
A question about kind of starting out as maybe a grad student or early career researcher. How do you build relationships with policymakers to kind of gain credibility and establish these long-term relationships? The individual says, can provide a policymaker with a one-pager, but will they actually ever read it, and will this kind of matter in the long run?
So I will say, I will say you're exactly spot on. The point of a lot of our science policy, and the thing we emphasize with every single event we do, is that this is about building a relationship. So it's really not about the one-off interaction. You're really, when you get into policy and legislation, you are playing the long game. I'll just let you guys know. The average bill takes 7 years to pass in Congress. So yes, yes, Olivia, yes, 7 years. So you're playing the long game, really. And I would say, and I also want to tell you just straight up, I feel like people on Capitol Hill love students so much, especially members of Congress. There's just something that's apparently very affable and photogenic about students that drives Capitol Hill wild. So all that to say, it's totally worth it. And I think so. A lot of the onus of building relationships with policymakers is on you. So it's up to you to keep re-engaging with them. And a lot of times we say, 3 or 4 times a year, just remind them who you are. And, maybe send them that one pager every single time, or update it when you work on a new project or something exciting happens at your institution. I would say, I'll also mention that advocacy happens in coalition. So think about where you can find your community. And I say this especially because grad students are so active in policy, not just science policy. Like I believe there's the National Student Policy Network. I can think of a couple of, I know a lot of people who started science policy or grad policy groups at their campuses. So, think about, kind of amplifying your own power by joining with other students and grad students who share your interests.
And I'll add to that, just, again, as Brittany said, it's really about building a relationship. So it's in the follow-up, making sure that you're following up with that office. But there's also more than, there's multiple ways that you can engage with your legislators. So it's not just about meeting with them. You can invite them to your institution for a tour, obviously following up with the staff. You can go, to plug our own science policy efforts at AGU, you can follow us on Twitter, and you can we put out several engagements throughout the year where you can send emails or tweets right at your legislators around the various policy issues. So there's various ways you can continue engaging, and the more you engage, it's just, again, it's just like building a relationship with anybody. They get to know you, they get to remember your name, your face. And that that keeps that kind of momentum going. But as Brittany said, it's the long game. It's on you to continue that relationship building.
An interesting kind of technology question I never thought of. Since we are mostly digital and people might be sending things digitally, should folks just kind of stick to static images and that type of thing, just assuming that we living in kind of like a paper world, or are things like GIFs or any sort of animations or something like that appropriate when passing along digital one-pagers?
So I'll say, I think people link to like YouTube videos in their one-pagers. I think things like GIFs could be really exciting and interesting. I would say though, I'm just not sure. Capitol Hill inboxes do have like a higher level of security than the average inbox. So I'm just not sure if that would lead it to go to spam or like the image wouldn't show up. But I feel like I would try it out because it sounds really cool. And I've seen a lot of, I know I'm picturing kind of NASA imagery here of like the image of like the world and like snow covering the world or something. So I feel like that could be really engaging.
And I'll just pop in from a non-policy side, but as someone who deals a lot in animation and thinking about the way things look and how to grab attention, I agree with Brittany. If you can do things to make it more attention grabbing, that's great. Just with this all the time, just be cautious of not going too far. So using best judgment and like the idea of the wild animations for PowerPoint or something like that. So there's definitely a balance, but yeah, there's some amazing, especially with NASA, like we said, amazing data visualizations that could certainly add to a one pager. Another kind of clerical technical thing, but for things like thank yous and maybe just short follow-ups, not necessarily adding a ton of information, snail mail or email?
Definitely email. Email is the way to go.
Great.
Yeah. Snail mail in Congress has to be opened, and you guys might remember in the last decade, anthrax threat and like screened. So a lot of times when you send mail to Congress, and I have no idea what the situation's like now, they don't get it for, I would say, a month to 6 months, 6 weeks.
Yeah, and I'll just add, just don't be afraid to do follow-up too. If you do email a staffer, a member of Congress, and you don't hear from them, don't feel like you're bothering them by like sending a follow-up email. Like that's their job. They're there to work for you, and you're their constituent. Just follow up, like a week later, say, hey, just following up with you, because they do get a lot of emails, a lot of meeting requests and stuff like that, and sometimes they go on recess or they're not in the office. So yeah, just don't be afraid to follow up with your emails.
There's a comment, and this is probably a good thing to reiterate, but just about speaking from personal experience, that the university might get upset if you don't let them know if you are meeting with a member of Congress or something like that. So Brittany mentioned about, or Brittany or Michael mentioned about meeting with your government affairs folks or whoever they're called at your university. So yeah, just to reiterate, if you ever have a question or you want to establish a relationship or it's a first time thing, those resources, those people are there to help you. And so start with them because they'll definitely know the direction to go. And we say the same thing with journalists when talking to public information officers or your comms folks or something like that.
And I would also, okay. I just want to also add that we didn't talk about this, but also to, that's what AGU's public affairs team is also here. We're also here to help and provide guidance. We have established relationships with lots of members of Congress and experience, and we're happy to help you also form and build your own relationships with members of Congress. So use your resources for sure.
And we'll do one more. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions. Some of them are kind of more individual. We'll try to get to those, and then we'll follow up in the follow-up email, some of the more general ones, try to get to those as well. But just kind of maybe a good one to end on. There were a handful of comments about, do you think that, especially right now, do politicians actually want to hear from scientists, or do they have the time to hear from scientists? And is it really worth it, especially now, to be talking about things that aren't necessarily maybe like COVID or whatever else is in the news currently?
Brittany, I'll let you take it and then I'll add. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite idioms from a former coworker. And she used to say, if you're not at the table, you're what's for dinner. And kind of just emphasizing the point that if you're not keeping up the dialogue, I was the example I always use is that there's like a toy caucus, right? So if the toy people are on the Hill talking about the issues that are important to them, scientists should be on the Hill talking about the issues that are important to them in science. And I would also say that, especially in the earth and space sciences, so many of the issues, so yes, COVID is happening right now, but wildfires are also happening right now. Climate change is also happening right now. Sea level rise is happening right now. NASA's still fighting to go to the Mars right now, and the moon. So just because I think the pandemic is dominating a lot of conversation, and I think, you know, in March and April, it was really hard to have a conversation that wasn't COVID related. But now, especially with the election coming up, you know, I think what we're hopeful Americans, and we all see past COVID-19, and these issues are going to all still be there despite the pandemic. And these issues are still existing alongside the pandemic. So I think it's always an important time to engage. Definitely exercise your best judgment, you know, when we have natural disasters or, you know, national crises and stuff like that. But I think science is always a relevant topic. Even with our DEI Virtual Advocacy Day, we had it in June, and we debated a lot about whether that was too soon, you know, related to COVID. But then, you know, we pivoted our messaging a little bit and talked about how important the scientific workforce is to conquering, you know, pandemics and other, you know, crises. And, you know, I think that was a message that really resonated. I think science is often very timely. So just think about, how is your science or the greater landscape of science timely right now, which it always is. There's always a connection. And if you can't find it, come talk to me in my book.
Yeah. And I'll just add, you know, especially if you're from a district that, you know, where you have a representative that may be very anti-science or doesn't listen to a lot of science, one of the ways that can help, you know, is to we actually need more scientists to engage your legislators, because, you know, going back to what I said during the presentation, the policymakers, you know, they do care about their constituency. I mean, you put them in office. So for, you know, the more scientists that engage with them from their own district that are constituents, they're going to see that this is important because, you know, there's a larger community of people with a science background, or, you know, that scientists that actually that are here to talk to me about policy, versus just, you know, if there's just one person from their district that happens to be a scientist that talks to them, it's not as impactful. So, you know, I encourage you to reach out to your colleagues and your coworkers and your fellow science community in your, you know, in your own local community to get more involved in science policy and engage policymakers on all levels.
Great. Well, we are a couple minutes over, so thank you all for sticking with us. Thank you again to Brittany and Michael for sharing their expertise with us and answering all the questions. Like I said, we will follow up afterwards. Thanks again for sticking with us through our technical issues, and we'll be in touch soon. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.